This is Greek with David Hutchison. Person, number, voice. When we speak about person, we're talking about first person, second person, or third person. When we talk about number, we're talking about singular or plural. And when we talk about voice, we're talking about active, middle, or passive. So let's take a look at each of these. On person, now you know that first person means I or we, second person means you, either singular or plural, and third person means he, she, it, or they. So let's look at some of these uses that defy the normal logic. Sometimes the first person can be used in the sense of one or someone. When someone does this, it's for the sake of vividness, making something more universal. Paul does this in 1 Corinthians 10 in the discussion of food sacrificed to idols, when he says, if I partake with thanksgiving, ego kariti meteko, why am I denounced for that for which I give thanks? All of these verbs highlighted in red, Paul's not only talking about himself, but he's talking about anybody. If anybody does this, why would that person be denounced? So this would be an example of first person where it's not only talking about I, but it's really talking about anybody, one or someone, if a person does such a thing. Now there's a related question to that. Can the same thing happen in Greek with second person? That is, can you ever mean one or someone? We do this in English, but the question is, did they do it in first century Greek? And according to Wallace, the answer is no, that you always means you, not one or someone. So for example, in John 4, the discussion at the well, when the woman asks him, Pathen un ekes ta hudor ta zon, it's not where does one keep this living water or where does this living water happen to be, but where do you keep this living water? Where do you have it? So if Wallace is correct, you means you. Now when you run across we or us, what does we or us mean? These first person pronouns do have a wide range of meanings. When you say we or you say us, the author could be talking about himself as well as the readers. So God loves us could mean everybody. God loves all of us. We or us could mean simply the author and his associates. We're coming for a visit. Might not mean everybody, the author and the readers, but simply the authors and his associates. And then there's also a usage where we can be used just in the sense of the author only and the author in the singular. This is called the epistolary plural. Context is going to help you make these decisions. In particular, sometimes there's a marked shift, such as Ephesians 1, where there's a whole bunch of us language, then a whole bunch of you language. There may be a shift going on here. I think there is. So a good habit to get into when you see the word we, or you see the word us in a text, ask, who is the we? Who is the us? So let's look at some of these. Inclusive we, this is when we or us means the authors and the readers. So here's Ephesians chapter 2 now. Hati di autu ekamen tein prosagogein hoi amphatoroi in hini pneumati proston patera. Through him we have access. Now, it's not just we have, but notice this word both. We both have access by one Spirit to the Father. So Ephesians, Paul is talking first about Israel, or about the Jews, believing Jews. Then he's talking about Gentiles who are not in. And then there's this marked shift where he says, now us, both of us. What do we together have? Jews and Gentiles together have access by one Spirit to the Father. So you've got these contextual clues, the word both. But there are other less obvious contextual clues, but do pay attention to context. So we can mean everybody in the sense of both us writing as well as you reading. Sometimes we only means the author and his co-workers, such as 1 Corinthians 4, Hemes moroi dia Christon, humeste phronimoi in Christo. We are fools for Christ, but you are wise in Christ. We have a distinction between we and you, so we know that the readers are not included. Is Paul talking about himself only, or also himself and his co-workers? If he's talking about himself and his co-workers, it's an exclusive we. It's Paul and his associates. If he's only talking about himself, then it would be this next category, which we'll call epistolary plural, where an author uses we in the plural, but he's only talking about, really he's talking about I. This is a debatable category. We do this in English. I might write a letter to you and I say, we regret to inform you that you only made 150 on your Greek exam. Really, the only person writing is me, but it's just a literary device. How would you know if you have this? Well, if you're dealing with a letter that only has a single author, and all of a sudden a first-person plural shows up, you may have one of these going on. In 2 Corinthians, when Paul is being questioned, his authority and his apostleship, all of these things are under fire by some opponents. They were saying, well, he sure writes a good letter, but he doesn't look like much when he shows up in person. So he says, what we are when absent in word through letters, we are in reality. And so here the we is not Paul and his co-workers, but probably it's just Paul himself, because he was the one being questioned. And so if this is the case here, then this would be an example of an epistolary plural or an editorial we. We really just means I, but it's for effect. Now let's take a look at number. The basic rule of subject-verb agreement is that a verb normally agrees with its subject in person and in number. A singular subject is going to take a singular verb, and a plural subject takes a plural verb. And a first-person subject would have to take a first-person verb, a second person would have to take second person, and third person would have to take third person. But particularly what we're going to see is things going back and forth with the number, because there are special usages which occur that don't follow these principles. So what do you have when you have a compound subject? A compound subject normally takes a plural verb. Peter and James, James and John. This would be a compound subject, not just a single subject, but a compound subject. So, for example, if we were to say Brett and Heidi are talking on the phone, you've got a compound subject there, Brett and Heidi. You wouldn't say Brett and Heidi is talking on the phone. You would say Brett and Heidi are talking. Compound subjects normally take plural verbs. The same thing happens in Greek. But there are some exceptions in Greek. If you had multiple subjects, but they're grouped together as a single entity, they might take a singular verb. In Matthew 5, Jesus says, Heos on parelthe ha uranos kai hege. So the heaven and the earth, that's the subject, it's the nominative. That's a compound subject. You would normally expect it to take a plural verb, but look at the verb, it's singular, parelthe. Why does this compound subject take a singular verb? Well, probably because heaven and earth are together viewed as one thing. Heaven and earth. So there's one exception. Another exception, if you have a compound subject and really what you want to do is emphasize the first subject and the others are kind of along for the ride, then the verb would be singular. You'll see this in the Gospels. So here we have Jesus, ha Jesus, kai hoi mathetai autu, that's the subject, Jesus and his disciples. And then the verb, eklethe, is singular rather than plural. So in English, if I translated this very literally, it would say Jesus and his disciples was invited to the wedding. Basically, what's going on here is it's saying something like, Jesus was invited to the wedding. Oh, and by the way, so were his disciples. If you want to emphasize the first named subject, you can do this, compound subject with a singular verb. It's also possible to take a collective singular subject with a plural verb. A collective singular subject is something that's in reality more than one, but it's grouped together into a collective singular, like a crowd or a group. So you might see this, the whole crowd, pas ha-akos et zeitun haptesthai autu. The whole crowd was seeking to touch him. Crowd is singular, the verb is plural. Singular subject, plural verb, it's a collective singular subject. There's an odd rule that you learned in first year Greek that neuter plural subjects normally take a third singular verb. This is the type of rule I say that you're going to mess up 5 or 10 or 15 times, and then finally you'll get it. When it does this, this kind of focuses on the collective whole. So for example, ta archaia par elthen. Ta archaia is the nominative subject, it's neuter plural, but that verb par elthen is third singular. So this is just the normal type of thing that you expect. Neuter plural subjects take a third singular verb. Now, it doesn't always do that. If an author wants to emphasize the individuality of the members which make up the subject, each one of them, then it might do a plural verb. So, ta probata ta ema tes phanes mu akuusen. My sheep hear my voice. Every one of them does. Now let's take a look at voice. Active, middle, and passive voice. So active voice, the subject acts upon the verb. The boy hit the ball. Middle voice, here we're dealing with special involvement of the subject in the action of the verb. The boy hit himself, the boy himself hit, or the boy hit for himself. Remember we did luo, I loose myself, I loose for myself, I myself loose. This special involvement sense is this middle idea. And then the passive, the subject is acted upon. The boy was hit by the ball. On the active voice. What we would call the normal use of the active is the simple active. Here the subject performs or experiences the action. The subject is the actor. So you could point to numerous verses, but here's one out of Titus. Kata ta autu eleos esosin hemas. According to his mercy, he saved us. The he is built into the verb. He is doing the action, so it's just simply simple active. You could have an active voice where the subject isn't actually doing the action, but he is causing the action. So a good example of this one is in John 19, when Pilate flogs Jesus. Almost certainly it wasn't Pilate himself doing the flogging, but Pilate had him flogged. So context would have to determine and demonstrate that the subject himself is not performing the action. And here the type of context, what type of context would that be? Well, not only literary context, but also cultural context. How does flogging work? Does the ruler normally do it? So context is a big word. But this one we would say, Pilate took Jesus and he flogged him. Or perhaps better, with the NIV in this case, had him flogged, if you're quite confident that this is indeed a causative active. You can have an active voice verb that's not expressing action, but more of a state of being, so we could call it a stative active. Now, Wallace will say that this could be with a being verb or a verb that has the sense of am plus a predicate adjective. Do remember, of course, that being verbs are not technically active, although you will see them parsed as such in Bible software programs. But do remember that being verbs are not actually active, but if you want to call them stative, that's fine. Here's one with a participle, zelosantes de hoi Judaioi. The Jews being jealous. So if this expresses this state of being, then we could say it's stative. With a reflexive active verb, the subject acts upon himself. So you'll have a reflexive pronoun with this, like a himself or a herself, and you'll have that active verb. 1 Corinthians 11, dokemazeto de anthropos heauton. So you've got the active verb in dokemazeto, and then you've got the reflexive pronoun heauton. So active verb plus reflexive pronoun equals reflexive active. So those were some examples of active. Now how about middle? Remember that the middle is the special involvement of the subject in the action of the verb. One nuance of this middle is the reflexive idea, which some people call the direct middle. Maybe if you call it reflexive middle, it might be a little more obvious to you what that means. On this one, the subject acts upon himself. This is the same thing, basically, as an active verb with that reflexive pronoun, but this is just more compact. You don't have to have the two elements. You can just have the one element, the middle voice verb. This was popular in classical Greek. By the time of the New Testament, it was waning, moving more towards that active voice verb plus the reflexive pronoun. And remember, this type of thing was happening in first century Greek because Greek was being spoken by more and more people. And when more and more people pick up a language, it's a foreign language, it's becoming new to them. Some of the subtleties, some of the nuances start to disappear, and things get a little more explicit. So Matthew 27, talking about Judas, kai apelthon apengxata. He went away and he hanged himself. That's that middle voice verb. He did it to himself. He hanged himself. This reflexive idea. There's also something called the indirect middle. I'm going to split this into two different categories. Now notice what I just did there. On the screen I said we will split this, but really what I mean is I will split it. This would be that epistolary plural. I'm going to split this into two different categories. The intensive idea, the I myself loose idea. And then what I'm calling, no one else calls it this, so if you call it this, just know that you're going with my nomenclature, but it expresses the concept quite well. What I will call the middle of advantage or the middle of personal interest. This is the idea of I loose for myself. People simply group these together under indirect, but I think these ideas are distinct enough, and really these labels are more meaningful than just plain old indirect middle, which doesn't really tell you much of anything in my view. But intensive middle, that tells you something I myself loose. Middle of advantage, I loose for myself. Middle of personal interest, I loose for myself. So what I think you should probably do is get in the habit of calling these indirect intensive or indirect advantage or indirect personal interest, something like that, so that you keep the word indirect so that when you read commentaries, if they say this sort of thing, you at least know what they mean by it. So let's take a look at the indirect intensive. So the subject himself, of course it could also be herself, themselves, performs the action. Hebrews 9, we've got this middle verb obtained. He entered the holy place once for all, having himself obtained eternal redemption. He himself did it. He himself did it. So this would be this intensive idea. The middle of advantage idea or personal interest is when there is a clear for himself or for his own benefit sort of an idea. It's for his own interest. Luke 10:42, Mariam gar tain agathain merida exelexata. Mary chose the good part. She chose it for herself. She chose it for her own benefit, for her interest. So this is middle, but the idea going on here is that she did it and it's beneficial to her. It's to her advantage. A middle can also do something called a reciprocal middle. This is the one another idea. Here, a plural subject, when using a middle verb, is interacting among themselves. They're interacting with one another. Matthew 26, Sunebul Yusanta, they plotted together in order that they might seize Jesus and kill him. So it's a middle voice verb, and the idea here in context is that they were plotting together, plotting with one another. It's this one another idea, reciprocal middle. A few other uses of the middle that I think will be obvious enough without having to give an example. You could have a redundant middle. That's where you have a middle. It can already have this reflexive nature, but if you add an extra reflexive pronoun there, it's just redundant. So let's call it a redundant middle. You've got a middle voice verb and you've got a reflexive pronoun. This causative and permissive middle, here context would have to show you that the subject is causing something or permitting something to be done to himself. And then I want to spend a little bit of time on this concept of deponency. And let's go ahead and talk about the passive at the same time. A deponent middle or a deponent passive. The idea of a deponent verb is that it's middle or passive in form, but active in meaning. Middle or passive in form, but active in meaning. And the word deponent comes from a Latin word which means to lay aside. And so there's a debate, what was exactly laid aside? Some people say it was an active form, others that it was the force of the middle or the passive in favor of this active meaning, but something's been laid aside, so there's a debate there. Now a verb could be deponent in all of its tenses or only in some of them. So in other words, maybe a verb in the present tense has active and middle and passive. Well, in that tense, since it has active and middle and passive, the middle and passive are actually middle or passive. They're not deponent. But maybe in another tense, it doesn't have an active form, and the middle or passive seems to be used with that force, then you could call it deponent in that tense. The simple test, when we learned about deponents last year, if the verb ends in oh my, then the word is a deponent. In other words, the lexical form you see is not an active form, but it's a middle or passive form. If you wanted to do a thorough test, what you'd actually have to do is not only look at New Testament literature, and that's why the New Testament lexicon would have it as a deponent, because in New Testament it's never used in the active, but go ahead and look at broader literature. Look at other common Greek in the first century. There's a lexicon by Moulton and Milligan. Or if you wanted to look at classical Greek, Liddell Scott Jones, often abbreviated LSJ. It's just a good reminder to pay attention to lexicons for information on deponents. Now there is a growing movement among scholars to suggest that deponency is an illegitimate category. So many have questioned it. I'll list a few here who participated in a 2010 SBL session on the question. The idea here is that we don't need this category of deponency, but what we need is a broader understanding of the middle voice. If you understand the middle voice more thoroughly, the range of things that it can do, that range is big enough to contain this idea of deponency. One book, Using and Enjoying Biblical Greek, in a very short appendix on this, He simply said ancient Greek grammarians did not understand verbs in this way. That is, in this deponent sort of a sense. What you'll commonly see in these discussions is that this is a Latin category. Latin grammarians who then went on to study Greek were taking what was true of Latin and forcing it upon Greek. Another reason why they argue people have come up with this concept is that the middle voice is hard to understand in English, and so that difficulty has been placed upon our Greek understanding. So it's really an error from an English perspective. So what they conclude is that verbs without an active form, they're not deponent, they haven't laid aside an active form, but what they are is simply true middles. Some people will call them middle-only verbs. And a lot of the verbs that are supposedly deponent, if you take a look at, you can see how they could express one of these middle sort of ideas. So they're just kind of built-in middles. So I think this concept would work for a lot of these deponents, and there is again a large shift towards this perspective. But there are some challenges remaining to this position that in my mind have not quite yet been met. The biggest challenge is what we could call a passive deponent. A middle deponent, if we want to say it's just really a true middle, it's not acting like active, it's just a true middle, well, that's fine. We can do that. But what are we going to do about forms that are actually passive? Remember, some middle and passive forms were a shared form. Present, middle or passive, luamai, it could be middle or it could be passive with that exact same form. So what you had to do was context. So that's a shared form. Imperfect middle or passive was the shared form. Perfect middle and passive was a shared form. But there were a couple of forms that are not shared forms. Aorist passive and future passive. Those are built off of the same principal part, and they're different. So there's an aorist middle, it's its own form, and there's an aorist passive. Then there's a future middle, and then there's a future passive. So the question is, if these are really middle voice forms and not deponents, then why aren't they middle? Why are they using this separate form? Why are they using a passive form instead of a middle form? Now, one response to this is that passive forms were in the process of replacing middle, and so you see some overlap. So when you see one of these that you think is a deponent, that people call a deponent, but if there's no such thing as deponent, then what it really is a middle that's really a middle that looks like a passive, but it's really a middle. So perhaps this solution is possible with the evolution of the language and some overlap of the form. It's not entirely satisfactory. This question is still an open question, but there is a large movement towards rejecting this concept of deponency. So what should you do? I would suggest if you see something that you think is a deponent, see if you can understand it as a middle. If not, if it's one of these passive forms, then perhaps we need to wait further review. So let's move into the passive voice now. The idea of a simple passive is that the subject receives the action of the verb. The subject is acted upon. Humeste in pneumati baptisthesiste hagio. But you will be baptized. You're not baptizing, but you're being baptized. You're acted upon. You will be baptized with the Holy Spirit. It's also possible to have a causative or permissive passive where the subject is being acted upon, but the subject is, in addition to that, you could see contextually that the subject is permitting or causing that action. Diate uki malon apostereste. Why not rather be cheated? This was in the discussion of going to law, believer against believer. These believers thought they were so mature and so wise, but they couldn't even solve a simple dispute amongst themselves. Well, then Paul will say, well, even still, why not rather be cheated? Why not cause this action to happen? You're acted upon. Why not cause it? Why not permit it for the sake of the gospel? So this could be an example of this causative or permissive idea. Now, deponent passive, remember these are forms that are passive in form but active in meaning. I won't repeat everything I just said about deponency a moment ago, just refer back to that. Now, when you have a passive verb, the subject is being acted upon. A natural question is by whom? Who's doing the action? And so we call this concept agency. We talked about this last year. I'll remind you. You could have a direct agent or an ultimate agent. You would see this with hupa or apa, sometimes para. But if you have hupa, an agency phrase with hupa, then it's telling you who the ultimate agent is, who the direct agent is. You could have an intermediate agent, sometimes called an indirect agent. This you would have the prepositional phrase beginning with dia. And then impersonal means or instrumental means, you would have in or simply the dative. And very rarely you might have ek. The most frequent of these are hupa, dia, or in. And so you would have direct agency, indirect agency, or impersonal means. But I'm adding in some of these other prepositions that can accomplish this same task. Here's a good example illustrating the first two of those three categories. Tuta de halan geganin hina plerothe ta rethon. Now here's the phrase. Hupa kuriu dia tu prophetu. All of this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord, ultimate agency, hupa kuriu, hupa plus the genitive there, through the prophet, dia plus the genitive, intermediate agent, dia plus the genitive. So the ultimate agent is the Lord, the intermediate agent is through the prophet. And as long as we're talking about agency, I'll talk very briefly about one other thing that's called a divine passive. If you have no agent explicitly stated, but from context you assume that the agent is God, you could call this a divine passive. Some people will say that this is because Jews didn't like to say the name of God, and so that's why you would have a divine passive. Probably true in the Old Testament, maybe not true in the New Testament. It could simply be a matter of style, but perhaps there's an overlap there. Semitic usage overlapping with stylistic sorts of things. But this is what a divine passive is. It's no agency phrase explicitly stated, but you're assuming that the agent is God. And to wrap up this discussion, one little reminder about shared forms. When a form could either be middle or passive, how do you know which is which? Remember that a passive verb will rarely have a direct object. It's hard for a passive construction to work that way with a direct object. So passive verb rarely has a direct object. Passive verbs do often have an agency phrase. So here's what you could say. If there's a direct object, it's probably middle. If there's an agency phrase, it's probably passive. And of course, in addition to these contextual clues, you'll have other contextual clues that will help you to decide if the form is middle or passive.